Julius Eastman, 1940-1990, was a taut, wiry, gay African-American man. He had such an appearance of athleticism and pent-up energy that he could look dangerous. Yet he had a gentle sense of humor, and his deep, sepulchral voice, incommensurate with his slight figure, conveyed the solemn authority of a prophet. He was a fiery pianist and a singer of phenomenal range and power. In 1970, he gave the American premiere at Aspen of Peter Maxwell Davies' 8 Songs for a Mad King, a crazy theater piece depicting the descent into dementia of King George III, and one of the most difficult and demanding vocal works of the avant-garde. His astounding 1973 recording of the piece for Nonsuch was probably the closest he ever came to any visibility in the mainstream music world. Born in October 27, 1940, Eastman began studying piano at the age of 14, showing quick promise, and became a paid chorister in the Episcopal Church in Ithaca, New York, where he was raised. He started at Ithaca College and then transferred to the Curtis Institute, where he switched from piano to composition, though he did study piano with Miroslav Prosovich. Constant Buckland was his composition teacher, and Eastman graduated in 1966. Discovered by composer-conductor Lucas Foss, Eastman joined, in 1968, the Creative Associates at SUNY Buffalo, the ensemble of crackerjack performers who coalesced around Foss's and later Morton Feldman's presence at that school, led by pianist Ivar Miskashoff, percussionist Jan Williams, and others. Eastman also became a member of the SIM ensemble, whose acronym didn't stand for anything, except for, perhaps, the middle of the word ensemble, led by flutist composer Petra Kotick. The first time I saw Eastman at Oberlin College in the mid-70s, he and Kotick were touring as a duo, playing their own works, pieces that went on and on and on forever, with the kind of lightly inflected purposelessness of Gertrude Stein's prose. Kotick, in fact, often set Stein's text for Eastman to sing. I next saw Eastman in 1975 at the first June in Buffalo Festival at SUNY Buffalo, organized by Feldman to bring famous composers and young composers in contact with each other. It was a notorious appearance to which today still clings a legendary resonance in the new music world. The famous composers involved that first year, besides Feldman, were John Cage, Earl Brown, and Christian Wolff, the original New York school. During a performance of Cage's theater piece, Songbooks, that was chaotic in the best sense of the word, Eastman performed the segment of Songbooks that was merely the instruction, give a lecture. Never shy about his gayness, Eastman lectured on sex with a young man, his lover at the time, and a woman, his sister, as volunteers. He undressed the young man on stage and attempted to undress the woman, who resisted. The next day, the ever mild-mannered Cage gave an angry lecture about the misuse of performances of his music, and before our incredulous eyes, pounded his fist on the piano like Khrushchev to punctuate these words: "The freedom in my music does not mean the freedom to be irresponsible." The sensationalist aspect of this episode has overshadowed what Cage was really worried about. One, that his celebrated generosity and openness was a bit fragile. Two, Eastman's outrageous behavior pointed out a hidden preference of Cage's and a problematic concerning the interpretation of his scores. For example, David Tudor, the tireless interpreter of his work for many years, made many important alterations in the scores on several occasions, and that was okay with Cage. But Cage could not explain why other interpretations, for example Eastman's, were not so satisfactory. Beneath Eastman's brilliant and notorious reputation as a singer, he also toured with Meredith Monk in 1981 and sang in her production Dolman Music. And with the fact that he was also one of the leading and most important composers to surface in the wake of the minimalist music movement. Foss conducted his music with the Brooklyn Philharmonic. Eastman's Stay On It in 1973 was toured across Europe by the Creative Associates. It was one of the first minimalist-based pieces to show pop music influence, and also an early use of improvisation in a notated context. By 1979, Eastman was touring with a set of amazing works for multiple pianos that took the minimalist device and added a process to a new structural level in the service of an irresistible political motivation. He presented those pieces at Northwestern University in 1980, the third time I ran into him. In 1981, they were performed again at New Music America in Minneapolis. As a composer, as well as performer, Eastman was a fixture in the new music boom of the late 70s and 80s. The scene had gotten off to a tentative but ambitious start in 1958 when Lamont Young and Terry Riley left Berkeley to move to New York City. In 1960, Young and Richard Maxwell curated a wild experimental music series in Yoko Ono's loft in downtown Manhattan, a geopolitical oddity as well as an aesthetic one, because at the time, most classical, end quote, concerts happened uptown, in the neighborhood of Lincoln Center, which soon occupied. Eastman was an integral figure in this scene, but somehow its successes never translated to his own music. He appeared in New Music America in 1980 with Evil Nigger and Gay Gorilla, and 1981 with the holy presence of Joan Arc. He toured Europe several times, sometimes playing his own works, sponsored by The Kitchen, but he never had a commercial recording during his lifetime. Eager for the prestige that he rightly felt his magnificent musicianship merited, he searched endlessly for an academic teaching position. He had been promised one at Cornell, and after it failed to materialize in 1983, his life began to fall apart. He began drinking heavily and smoking crack. For a while he worked at Tower Records, until he just disappeared one day. He was kicked out of his Manhattan apartment at 4th Street and 2nd Avenue, and many of his belongings, probably including scores, were confiscated by the sheriff's office. He ended up living at least part of the time in Tompkins Square Park. Somehow he died alone in a hospital in Buffalo, officially of cardiac arrest, brought on, depending on whom you talk to, by insomnia, tuberculosis, dehydration, starvation, exhaustion, or depression. Eastman's brother, Jerry, the guitarist for the Count Basie Orchestra, has blamed Julius's decline on racism in the classical music world, calling his brother just another in the line of geniuses who got squashed in this particular hemisphere. Yet others point to ways that Eastman shot himself in the foot, losing an invitation from the Paris Conservatory by demanding an unreasonably large fee, screwing up a theory teaching stint at SUNY because he couldn't adjust to the discipline of paperwork. None of Eastman's works can be said to have become well known, but the piece that remains most often associated with his name is the earliest one we have, Stay On It from 1973, scored for voice, clarinet, 2 saxophones, violin, piano, and mallet percussion. For its date, it is a truly remarkable work. Keep in mind that at this time, Steve Reich had produced drumming, but not yet music for 18 musicians. And Philip Glass had made music with changing parts, but not yet music in 12 parts, or Einstein. In other words, minimalism was a movement still in its austere phase, one-dimensionally conceptual and concerned with abstract patterns. In one giant step, Eastman upped the ante considerably and forecast things that would be happening to the movement 15 years hence. In the first place, he takes for his primary material a kind of pop, tangential figure, mixing genres and making reference to a sonic object outside the style he's working in. In the 1980s, post-minimalist and sampling music would swing off in this direction, but not in the 70s. Better tell what structure is than simply to tell about this talk, which is contained within a space of time, approximately 40 minutes long. That 40 minutes has been divided 5 large parts, and each unit is divided likewise. Subdivision involving a square root is the only possible subdivision which permits this macrocosmic rhythmic structure, which I find so acceptable and accepting. As you see, I can say anything. It makes very little difference what I say, or even how I say it. At this particular moment, we are passing through the 4th part of a unit which is the 2nd unit in the large part of the talk. It is a little bit like passing through Kansas. This now is the end of the 2nd unit. Now begins the 3rd unit of the 2nd part. Now the 2nd part of that 3rd unit now is the 3rd part. Now it's 4th part, which by the way is just the same length as the 3rd part. Now the 5th and last part. You have just experienced the structure of this talk from a microcosmic point of view. From a macrocosmic point of view, we are just passing the halfway point in the 2nd large part. The first part was a rather rambling discussion of nothing, of form, and continuity. When it is the way we now need it, this 2nd part is about structure, how simple it is, what it is, and why we should be willing to accept its limitations. Most speeches are full of ideas. This one doesn't have to have any. But at any moment, an idea may come along, then we may enjoy it. Structure without life is dead, but life without structure is unseen. Pure life, expresses itself within and through structure. Each moment is absolute, alive, and significant. Blackbirds rise from a field, making sound, delicious, beyond compare. I heard them because I accepted the limitations of an arts conference in a Virginia girls' finishing school, which limitations allowed me, quite by accident, to hear the blackbirds as they flew up and overhead.